There's such a sharp demarcation line between natural history museums and the world of natural history on the one hand, and cultural museums on the other hand, that house archaeological or ethnological artifacts, etc. In the cultural museum space, the topic of restitution is absolutely inexorable, and it has become such a trending hot and also contested topic in the past years. This is a major discussion right now, and it's only slowly becoming to spill over into the world of natural history. Because there's such a strong perception of natural history being apolitical, sterile, of it being something that is not really politicized, socially relevant. But there are instances where natural history objects are being requested back.
And welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week we are joined by Paul Stewens. Paul has a BA in International Relations from TU Dresden. He is a Master's in International Law at the Graduate Institute of International and Developmental Studies and is currently undertaking a PhD at Maastricht University on the legal regulations of the extraction, transfer and ownership of paleontological objects. I've been struggling with that word all day. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I butchered the paleontological part, didn't I?
Well, let's wait until we get to all the hominin names, and then we see how well you fare.
Not well. I had like one class that involved hominins in my undergrad, and I was like, every time I had to spell them out, spell check was like, that's spelled wrong. And I'm like, I don't know if that's right or if spell check just doesn't know, and I'm not confident in my spelling abilities, and it was a disaster.
Okay.
So, you are a unique guest for the podcast in the aspect that you study law, not history or archaeology or any of the literary. We've had some literary guests on, but we haven't had any law students or researchers on. So this is very interesting to me, how it sort of applies to some of the things that we do think about in archaeology, but maybe not from a legal point of view. So it's very interesting to me. So I guess I first wanted to ask you just a little on your background, because when I was looking through your impressive website with your CV on it, I noticed how your undergrad bachelor's degree was like, your thesis was on pardoning war criminals, and now you're studying fossils and like the laws around that. So how do you go from like one to the other? What attracted you to this?
Yeah. So this is a bit a longer story, and I promise we will get to the human remains at the end of it. But like many kids growing up, I had an intense interest in dinosaurs. I had a dinosaur special interest that didn't lead me to becoming a paleontologist in the end, but it is a passion that never fully went away. And I had all my dinosaur toys and my dinosaur documentaries. I was really big on walking with dinosaurs when it came out. I was reading my dinosaur books. This was really one of the biggest passion of my childhood, I think. But it faded away just enough for me not to go into paleontology, and I think I also didn't have enough of a passion for rocks to do all the geology elements that a paleontology degree would also require. And I, at some point, started an interest in becoming a diplomat. And so this is how I got more into the international relations trajectory, where I, during my bachelor's, already majored in international law. This was among the disciplines that I was studying, the one that most spoke to me. But the dinosaur passion had never fully gone away. Among other things, I was watching Ben G. Thomas, an amazing YouTube channel who does that does a lot of paleontology content. And I remember in the end of 2020, I watched a video of theirs. We can perhaps put a link in the podcast description about amber from Myanmar. It was a 10, 12, 15-minute video, something like this, which featured the most recent discoveries that were made studying amber from Myanmar and the fossil inclusions. Now, those who are familiar with Jurassic Park might remember that they have the mine in the Dominican Republic in the second opening scene of the movie, where they dig for the amber with mosquitoes in it so that they can extract the dinosaur blood from the mosquitoes and then clone dinosaurs for a theme park. what could go wrong? Now, the cloning dinosaur pass for a theme park is not feasible as of now, and perhaps never will be, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you stand. However, amber is an extremely important and valuable material for scientists because the preservation in the fossilized tree resin makes it possible to study, for instance, entire insects that are preserved in a 3D shape. And the specimens that are preserved in amber, they don't get pressed flat into stone, but you can really have a 3D conservation sometimes for larger animals that are conserved. You can even have internal organs. You get the textures preserved, feathers, skin, scales, these things. On some occasions, you even find half a lizard that is trapped in amber and conserved. So there is a bunch of reasons why this is an interesting and fascinating material for scientists. The oldest and most biodiverse amber in the world is found in Myanmar, in the north of the country, in a region that has been plagued with civil war since at least 1960s. There was a bit of a calmer period in the early 2000s, 2010s in the democratization period. At the very latest, after the coup d'etat in 2021, things really went south. The situation is atrocious. There have been UN investigations that have looked into the interests of the Myanmar military that has a strong economic interest, as it turns out, in natural resource exploitation in the north of the country. We're talking amber, we're talking jade, ruby, other precious stones. And if it's not the military junta that exploits these resources, it's armed factions that control the mining areas. There are reports of forced labor, sexual slavery, and all of this material that is extracted there, the amber material, is smuggled across the border to China and then sold at a market in southern China. And there are paleontologists who turn up on these markets and try to pull out the scientifically interesting specimens, but there's also jewelry makers who go there, private collectors. So there's a bit of a bidding race in this context to see who gets access first to the most spectacular amber specimens that have been extracted, potentially using forced labor, potentially in a war zone in a neighboring country. And this has caused significant ethical debates in paleontology in, let's say, the early 2020s, if that's the thing that you say. And the debate essentially was whether it was ethically okay to keep studying fossil materials from Myanmar. And there were some who said that this is something that is scientifically justified by the new information that we retrieve from studying these materials, that if we don't study them, they will just be lost to science, so there's no point in imposing a moratorium. Whereas others were saying that if there is such a high chance that there is figurative blood sticking on these scientific materials, they shouldn't be studied. Moratoria should be imposed so that journals won't accept studies anymore that use amber materials from a specific time period that coincides with the eruption of the violence. So this has been a lot going back and forth. A lot of editorials and letters have been written in journals by scientific societies. This was a hot topic, and it was featured on the Benji Thomas channel in an amazing video. I found it interesting, but I didn't give much more of a thought to it until half a year later when I was doing an internship and they asked me to write a blog post for an international law blog that is based in Germany. And I needed an idea, something that was kind of original. In a moment of inspiration, the video that I'd watched half a year before crossed my mind, and I thought, maybe there's an interesting legal angle to this. And this was sort of this was the moment from which onward I started exploring this, and I soon would find out that paleontological objects are categorized as cultural property under international law, the same way that antiquities, ethnological collections, artworks, paintings, etc. would be, and that this activates a specific legal framework that would then also apply to the amber with fossil inclusions that is smuggled from Myanmar. this culminated in the publication of a little blog post on Völkerrechts blog. I didn't think much more of it. I thought it was just a punctual little thing that I would write. Colleagues from paleontology or paleobiology reached out to me saying that they were currently in the process of preparing a paper that was trying to do a scientometric analysis of the publications on Myanmar to show really the dimensions of the problem and to show who publishes on Myanmar, where the authors are based, etc., and whether I wanted to contribute some legal bits to the paper. And this was in the last year of my undergrad study, so it was very exciting to me not only to publish the blog post, but then also to be approached by real scientists who take an interest in my work. And this is then how I gradually discovered that there's actually many legal questions that surround paleontology and the dealing with fossils, the extraction, the transfer, the ownership, etc. And the longer I was looking, the more things I was discovering, to the more scientists I was talking to, I was collaborating with. And this then over time has grown into my current PhD project that I'm completing under the supervision of Donna Yates at Maastricht University. And the scope of my PhD project now is a bit wider than only fossils. And this is where we will eventually find the bridge to human remains. Because what I realized was sort of a fil rouge, so a connecting factor among different legal problems that had to do with fossils, was the issue of classification. Fossils, from a legal point of view, are a highly ambiguous material because depending on the country where you are, they fall in completely different legal boxes. Some countries have specific legislation that covers fossils, sure. In other places, it falls under the same legal category as antiquities. In others, they are cultural objects. Again, other countries declare fossils to be minerals, so they're more regulated in like the mining energy context. And in other places, there's no legislation that applies to fossils at all. So they're just movable property. And then it can become a question: who owns the fossil when it's found, etc. And this definitional ambiguity is something that I find fascinating because it's not something that law is particularly good at dealing with. Law has a very low tolerance for ambiguity because in the end, the classification determines what rules apply to a certain object. So it's sort of the precondition for the subsequent treatment of an object. Fossils being so ambiguous, I think, is the cause of many problems that we have in the legal preservation of the paleontological heritage. And this is why I found it interesting enough to make this my PhD research. And as I started looking into it, I realized that this is a problem that is also not exclusive to fossils, but it applies to different substances that take place in the same, let's call it natural history space, for lack of a more precise umbrella term, that share these characteristics. We can think of amber, which could be considered distinct as fossils because it overlaps with the gemstone market, for example. We can think of meteorites. Meteorites, a fascinating topic, is also a bit on the rise, is my impression, with more meteorites showing up on auctions, fetching higher prices. Also, meteorites being looted from museums. There's many things going on, and here also we have ambiguity. Is it a cultural object? Is it also part of space, really? So is it part of a celestial body that comes here? If it falls on someone's ground, is it movable property that can be taken away, or does it become part of the real estate onto which it falls? These kinds of questions. And finally, human remains also fall into this category. And this is something that has often been observed in the legal literature, that is really very hard to legally pinpoint what human remains are and how they should be treated. And there's the most common debate is whether they are part of a person, or whether they become property. But in my perspective, it's a lot more nuanced because there's even within these two main paradigms, if you will, there's a lot of subcategories and a lot of nuance and different legal regimes that might apply based on religious affiliation, on heritagization, depending on how long the person has been dead, on whether someone died in an armed conflict, whether it's a soldier's grave or not. So there's there are a lot of fuzziness, I think, also ontologically and legally surrounding human remains, and this is, to close off the whole loop, how I ended up taking an interest into this topical space in which we are sitting today.
Yeah, it was so interesting when you reached out to me, because human remains are obviously, I'm an osteo, so there's something that I think about, and the ethics around them being on display, and then, you know, people have them in private collections, like legacy collections from Victorian, you know, medical study student skeletons and stuff that have just been passed down generation to generation, and people just have them in their attic and they don't know. And I know in the UK they introduced laws a few years ago around them, and I think they're trying to introduce laws in Ireland, which is where I am, recently, around having human remains in your private collection, but the laws are still a bit iffy. I know our professional osteology group is not 100% on them, because there's a lot of, as you said, like, there's a lot of nuance and gray area, and they're not 100% solid, and you're like, right, but how do you stop someone from auctioning these, because your laws are kind of ambiguous as to what the ruling is. But I'd never really thought about it in regards to, like, fossils or amber or meteorites, or, you know, like, other things like that that obviously do hold value, you know, in research, but they also hold value to the country. They hold monetary value in some way. And so it would make sense that, like, there should be legal framework around them, the same way that we have around cultural heritage things, or more modern human remains as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think this diversity of values that you describe, and this diversity is really what makes the legal classification so complicated. Because in the end, if we afford special, or if the law affords special protection to something, this is a function of human appreciation, and of this item or relationship or whatever, of this being special to us, of this being important to us, and of the legislator deeming it deserving of a certain kind of protection. Now, this becomes complicated if we have one artifact or one object that enjoys these different types of value. As you were saying, that enjoys scientific value, that has cultural value, that has financial value, etc. And so, what appreciation is it that then makes the cut when it's about expressing this importance through a special legal protection? And I think we can really see a correspondence between the variety of forms of appreciation for these types of objects and the complications and clashes between the different legal frameworks that grow out of these forms of appreciation.
Mm-hmm. So you were mentioning, you know, how a lot of amber samples are coming from conflict areas, or formerly were coming from conflict areas. And so obviously there's issues with that, because they're, in a sense, well, the blood diamond kind of idea of, like, there's blood on this amber probably, and should we be using it for research purposes? But is there also an argument to be made that it's taking away from the, like, it's taking a resource away from the country as well, that could potentially be used to improve them later on, either through monetary means by selling it themselves, or through putting it on display or doing their own research? Is there more than just the, you know, this is bad because, you know, we're using slave labor to take it, and it's in a war zone and all of that? Like, there's a lot of impact from these, isn't there?
Surely. Are you familiar with the term parachute science?
I am not.
Okay, amazing. So parachute science is a term that has emerged in recent years to describe a particular form of neo-colonial research practices. The idea of parachute science is that we have a researcher, typically from the global north or from a high-income country, who sort of flies to another country, typically in the global south or a lower-income country, drops off with a parachute, extracts scientific material, scientific data, and then leaves the country again, takes the scientific materials back to the high-income country where they're based, and this is where they study the materials, publish on the materials, keep the materials, display the materials. And so it is a form of extractivism and of extractive research, because it uses the scientific resources, and in this case natural history specimens, of a different country without this benefiting local communities, researchers, or institutions whatsoever. And this is one of the phenomena that the work that colleagues and I have been doing on Myanmar Amber clearly shows, that if you see the world map of where all the research on Myanmar Amber takes place, none of it is happening in the country in itself. There's a few hotspot countries. China is a big one, and the rest is in Western Europe and the United States. But paleontologists in Myanmar rarely or almost never get to study these scientific materials in their own country. And this is not something that is limited to the problem of amber. My colleagues have shown this for fossils more broadly, that you can really see how countries in the global north tend to have a lot of materials in their collections that are not from these countries but have been taken from abroad, which is in part often a consequence of a colonial history and of colonial extraction of natural history materials, but it's still something that is happening. And with the amber from Myanmar, we see it today. We see it also with fossils that are being taken from Latin America. Brazil and Mexico are two hotspot countries who have suffered a lot of loss of fossils of their paleontological heritage at the hand of illicitly trafficked fossils that have then made their way to collections in the UK, in Germany, where they've studied and where they are studied, and where to a large part they remain to this day. And these are fossils that could otherwise be used for the training of paleontologists in Brazil, for students, for graduate students, for researchers in their qualifications. These are fossils that could also be studied and published on to advance the careers of Brazilian researchers in a scientific world that is heavily driven by metrics, publications, etc. But if these fossils are withdrawn from countries in the global south, the studies on them, they end up on the CVs and the publication lists of researchers in the global north. And the same goes for institutions, that the institutions in Brazil can't display many of the charismatic, beautiful specimens that have been discovered in that country, because through illicit channels they have made it to a different part of the world. And this phenomenon now has been called parachute science, which is a very, very graphic, I think, and a very intuitive way of putting it. And
I like it. It is very descriptive.
Yeah, and yeah, this is another major ethical concern, not only with respect to amber from Myanmar, but with how paleontology is done in many cases up until today, more broadly.
So we've heard cases recently, more recently now, in the last, I would say, 5-10 years, of cultural, historical items being requested that they be sent back to the country they are originally from. Obviously, the big case being Egypt wants their mummies back, which they should be allowed to have back. They have a beautiful new museum. They should put all their mummies in their beautiful new museum. But are there cases of countries seeking their paleontological items back? Like, are we seeing the same big sort of shift to repatriating paleontological objects the same way that we are seeing cultural objects or human remains in the archaeology space?
We don't see it as much as you would think, given how parallel these situations are. But we have this, I think there's such a sharp demarcation line between natural history museums and the world of natural history on the one hand, and cultural museums on the other hand, that house archaeological or ethnological artifacts, etc. And so in the cultural museum space, the topic of restitution is absolutely inexorable, and it has become such a trending hot and also contested topic in the past years. I think most importantly, starting from the from French President Macron's speech in Ouagadougou, and then also the report by Benedict Savoy and Felvin Sarr on the restitution of African art in European museums. So there, as you were saying, this is a major discussion right now, and it's only slowly becoming to spill over into the world of natural history, because there's such a strong perception of natural history being apolitical, sterile, of it being something that is not really political or politicized, socially relevant, and also relevant for the identity of places and peoples, as items in cultural history museums would be. But there are instances where natural history objects are being requested back. Brazil has been at the forefront of fighting for foster repatriation. The main case was that of Ubirajara jubatus, which is a chicken-sized dinosaur. So it looks extremely cute in the reconstructions. And this dinosaur had been removed from Brazil sometime before 2007, and then been traded to Germany, ended up in the German museum. It was published in 2020, and this caused an uproar in the Brazilian paleo community, because they were saying that Brazil has laws that prohibit the export of fossils, particularly holotypes, fossils that are then used to describe a new species based on a particular specimen, and that this fossil could never be legally in Germany, and that it should be repatriated. And this, I think, was the other major paleontology controversy of the past 5 years, the Ubirajara controversy, because the Brazilian paleontologists managed to really rally a lot of support, also just from members of the public who made a lot of protest art, shared the Ubirajara belongs to Brazil hashtag. And this, after 2 years, give or take, then also resulted in the repatriation. So the German Minister of Foreign Affairs at a trip to Brazil delivered the Ubirajara fossil back, and it's now exhibited in a Brazilian museum. This is a rare success case. There is a parallel case, that of Irritator challengeri, which is another Brazilian dinosaur which has a very similar history to Ubirajara, but is still in Germany. But there's thousands of Brazilian fossils in Germany, and of course, not all of them are requested back. But it is a topic that is being discussed also between the governments. So this repatriation also became possible because the Brazilian government got involved through the foreign office, etc. So that was quite a big deal. And to build the bridge to the human remains and the hominin fossils, there are also cases where hominin fossils are repatriated. The most significant case is only 2 months old or 3 months old by now. It's the case of Java man. Now, a Java man is it's a fossil of a Homo erectus, consisting of a skull cap, a molar, and a femur, that has been discovered in the 1890s by a Dutch physician who was an officer in the Dutch colonial army and had gone to the Dutch East Indies, which would later become Indonesia after the end of Dutch colonial rule, with the express purpose of finding the missing link between apes and modern humans. And he thought to have found it at Trinil on the island of Java. Specifically, it was a group of, I think, around 50 forced laborers that the Dutch government put at his disposal, who discovered these fossils. And they were sent to the Netherlands, to what would later become the Naturalis Biodiversity Center in Leiden. And there, the Java man fossils, together with thousands of other fossils that the expedition had uncovered, became the Dubois collection that had all these fossils, Dubois' personal belongings, the documentation of the expedition, etc. And the Java man fossil has been requested by Indonesia pretty much immediately after their independence from the Netherlands, so in the 1950s already. But the Dutch didn't really engage with the repatriation request back then. There were more requests, and after the Netherlands set up a colonial restitution committee, which features experts that then can receive requests and then will examine them and make an official recommendation to the government. Indonesia requested officially the return of the entire Dubois collection, including the very charismatic hominin fossil that is the centerpiece of the collection. That was in 2022. The committee assessed the case, produced a very extensive report of hundreds of pages and several appendices, and they recommended the return of the entire collection to Indonesia. And in September this year, the Dutch government announced that the entire Dubois collection would be unconditionally returned to Indonesia. And so I'm not sure in which state of the physical repatriation process we are now and whether the collection has already gone back, but the decision has been made and the collection will be going back to Indonesia. This is one example of a major hominin repatriation case. The other major case involves, and this institution is by no means a stranger to the restitution discourse, the British Museum, specifically.
As I know you're going to say that.
Or strictly speaking, the Natural History Museum, which used to be part of the British Museum and is a sort of separate entity since 1963. Because the Natural History Museum in London holds the Broken Hill skull, also known as Kabwe 1, which is the scientific designation. This skull belongs to a Homo heidelbergensis, and has been discovered in 1921 when in Zambia, which used to be the British colony of Northern Rhodesia back in the day. It wasn't discovered in the paleontological excavation, but rather in the context of a natural resource exploitation. So it was miners who found the skull. And one of the engineers of the mining operation took the skull, looked at it, and then ended up ensuring its transfer into the collection of the Natural History Museum. And this is where the Broken Hill skull sits until today. It has been studied extensively. A recent study from 2020 showed that it is around 299,000 years old. Zambia would like to have it back. Zambia would like to have it back. The first repatriation request comes from the 70s, and Zambian officials have consistently tried to open a negotiation to achieve a return, with limited success in the 70s, in the 90s again, and Zambia has then also decided to involve UNESCO to help with the repatriation efforts. And UNESCO has a specific committee, which is the Intergovernmental Committee on the Promotion of the Return of Cultural Property Objects. It's a very long name that I can't recite by heart, but essentially it's a committee that serves as a forum to support negotiation, mediation, conciliation between member states of UNESCO that oppose each other in the context of a repatriation request. Unsurprisingly, the famous Parthenon marbles have been before the committee for a good few decades now, with limited progress in the committee, it seems. And there are other cases that have been discussed. Some of them also have resulted in restitution. Other requests were not as successful. And Zambia has submitted the case of the Broken Hill skull to the committee in 2016. And now ever since, at the biannual sessions of the committee, Zambia makes an extensive statement. The United Kingdom responds to the statement. There's a report on what has been done in the meantime between the sessions, and then the different members of UNESCO that are also part of the committee get to share observations, and the states representatives pretty much say what they think of the request, of the progress, etc. So it's the forum, and in this context, Zambia has been trying to push for a repatriation of the Broken Hill skull even further. But of course, the committee is not a judicial body. It's really just a negotiation forum and something that is supposed to support and assist the negotiations between Zambia and the United Kingdom. But the committee doesn't have any power to compel the United Kingdom to give back the skull. And something which I found very curious happened at the session of 2024 last year, because Zambia changed its framing for the repatriation request. It before requested the Broken Hill skull as a scientific object. It also holds a lot of cultural value, but it was more along the lines of it being a national treasure. This is also the more the language that has been used back in the 90s when Zambia first tried to involve UNESCO. However, in 2024, the framing shifted, and Zambia is now claiming the Broken Hill skull as an ancestor. The Zambian representative goes into a lot of detail explaining how this individual to whom the Broken Hill skull belonged is an ancestor of the people of Zambia, or the people who live now in the region where it was discovered, and that as such they have a right to ancestral repatriation of the Broken Hill skull, and that it's in the end not of course, the British were saying that this is that this is an early human that lived 300,000 years ago, so it can hardly be considered an ancestor of the current population. To which the Zambian delegate responded that this that it's really not the United Kingdom's business to decide who someone else's ancestor is and not. So it was more along the lines of a sovereignty argumentation, I would say. And this, I think, is a particularly interesting case that shows the really the ambiguity of the Broken Hill skull as an object, because we could look at it, if we approach it through a purely scientific perspective, as an object of study for paleoanthropologists, an important artifact for the study of human evolution, and call it a day. But of course, there's also the cultural dimension of it, and there's the history of the colonial removal of it, added as a sign of Zambian archaeological sovereignty, if you will, that comes as a perspective on top. And then, as another layer of meaning, another layer of significance, we have the question of ancestry, really, and of more of a familial framing that we see a lot in human remains repatriation contexts, where indigenous human remains, for instance, are reclaimed as ancestors, even though there might not be a familial link or of kinship in a strict Western sense, but under a different cultural paradigm of ancestry, of kinship, of family, that individual whose remains might be found in a Western collection is in fact an ancestor, and someone to whom even a present day indigenous community might have a close connection. And the question is, to what extent is that an appropriate and an accurate and a helpful framing in the context of the repatriation of a hominin that lived 300,000 years ago?
It's interesting. When you first reached out to me, it was something I never really thought about, but it did make me think of it, of like hominins seem like this sort of group that would fall in the middle of two categories. They are technically
Yes.
paleontological fossils, but they are also human remains. And so, like, legally speaking, where do they fit in anywhere? Where do they fit in? Should they be sent back in the same way that mummies and bog bodies and skeletons are, or should they be treated as natural history, like objects? It is weird gray area, I would think. Legally, is it?
It certainly is, and it's yeah, it fascinates me as well. This is why I've been thinking about it so much recently, and the first thing that they teach you in law school is to answer every question with it depends. So I'm going to hit you with the good old it depends, because we are we can think of it as a species approach, if you will, to say that for something to count as human remains, it has to be part of the species of Homo sapiens, which seems like a safe call if you look at it from a legal point of view, because you would think, as a lawyer, that surely the scientists have a clear understanding of what a Homo sapiens is. After all, it's a species, it's a box, and so we as lawyers don't have to get our hands dirty. We source out the classificatory work to scientists. And I am by no means a paleoanthropologist, and it's also important for me not to overstretch the bounds of my qualification. That being said, my understanding is that there's not entirely clear cut perspective in paleoanthropology what actually counts into the Homo sapiens or not. It has long been a debate whether the Neanderthal actually constitutes a distinct species from Homo sapiens, so Homo neanderthalensis, or whether the Neanderthal is actually a subspecies of Homo sapiens, which would mean that the Neanderthal is Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and that our proper species is Homo sapiens sapiens, which is a term that some might have heard of, but a term that only makes sense to have the sapiens sapiens if there's another subspecies in Homo sapiens that would be the Neanderthal. And then again, if we can't resolve it at the species level, we might be tempted to resolve it at the genus level and say that everything that falls into the genus Homo would be counted as a human. But then again, this requires drawing a line where I think many scientists would be very uncomfortable to actually draw a line to say, okay, this is where the genus Homo starts, and this is where we would get more into Australopithecus or Paranthropus territory. So the species is, or a scientific taxonomic classification is probably not a good point of departure for law, not least because there's also so many different competing understandings of what a species is. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of definitions out there among scientists, and science can tolerate this ambiguity. And science also needs this diversity of approaches, I think, to thrive and to develop and to keep an open mind, to just approach the truth step by step a bit further, even though we might never reach it. Law, on the other hand, has a fundamentally different approach to ambiguity. Law cannot tolerate it, and law always has to come to an authoritative conclusion because the applicable law and the applicable rules depend on it. And so law needs to import certainty. And science, in this case, as far as the taxonomy of hominins go, really can't provide the certainty that law would need. Another point of departure could be the age of the remains. To say that after a certain cutoff point, they count as modern humans. Afterwards, they don't. This obviously is highly arbitrary, and also is complicated by the fact that dating techniques are not always super accurate, and that we sometimes might find surprises. There was the case of the Classes River remains in South Africa, which were initially thought to be 60,000 years old, but improved dating techniques then showed that they were no older than 500 years. And so here we have an example where the same remains might shift legal category depending on the technique of assessment that we use. So that might not be an ideal approach to drawing the line for what counts as human remains or not. With this, I do not want to say that I don't know the answer. I would rather question whether we need a clear answer. Human remains is that there is no legal category of human remains, strictly speaking. And the body of laws and rules that apply to the human body after death is so diverse and so fragmented that I think it would be a mistake of speaking of human remains as a consistent, coherent legal category in and of itself. which then makes it highly contextual. And the question becomes, are these human remains for the purposes of this or for the purposes of that? So the question then is, are these human remains for the purposes of sampling of bodily materials, destructive sampling, or are these human remains for the purposes of repatriation? And then we can look more into the different contexts, into the rationale behind the legal rules, and see whether we can fit a given set of human remains within the legal category. There is very little legislation that actually makes mention of hominin fossils. There are two cases from South Africa and Tanzania who have domestic laws that protect antiquities, and there they lump in the hominin fossils with all the other antiquities. So there's no distinction between hominin fossils and ordinary fossils, and there's no distinction between fossils, generally speaking, and antiquities, cultural artifacts, etc. And so here, the question whether these are human remains or not doesn't really matter, because it's all part of the same category. No distinction is required. At the level of museums, we often see policies regarding the treatment of human remains. Many British institutions have them, and these policies often are restricted to Homo sapiens. As it says specifically in the policy, human remains refer to body parts, blah, etc., of an individual belonging to the species of Homo sapiens. These are policies that usually govern the display of human remains, whether it's acceptable that they are visible on in the exhibition. They govern sampling, destructive sampling, so effectively the different things that you might want to do with human remains from a scientific and museological perspective, and whether they are deemed acceptable. And here we have the taxonomic classification as a dividing line in many cases. And so there, the policies are relatively clear that in the daily work of a museum, a curator wouldn't face any challenges putting a Homo erectus fossil, put Java Man, for example, on display, but they couldn't do the same for a Homo sapiens. Which leads to which can lead to absurd results. If we think of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals who did exist in Europe for a certain period of time, there we could have a Homo sapiens and a Neanderthal who died the exact same day, but the one could be destructively sampled, put in a display, etc. Whereas for the other one, this would not be possible because they're not part of Homo sapiens, if we assume that this is the case. So determining whether hominins count as human remains is contextual, and in these specific contexts we can give answers. And if we want to go back to the repatriation context, I think the most practical and appropriate way of looking at it is to consider hominin remains, hominin fossils, as cultural objects, and not to introduce distinction between these, because at least at the level of international law, there is no real distinction between these, and require repatriation as such. Because in the end, under the relevant international legal framework, it doesn't really matter whether it's a painting or an entomological collection, or a Roman vase, or hominin fossil, or a T-Rex skull. All of it falls under the same category of cultural property that in principle has to be returned. The one complication that we face is the question of indigenous human remains, essentially, because international law and many domestic legal systems, they don't introduce a distinction between non-indigenous human remains and general cultural property. Non-indigenous remains just go into the cultural property framework and are treated as such. And there is a difference for indigenous human remains that follows from, again, these different paradigms of kinship, of family, of ancestry, that might create a closer link even with distant ancestors than it would be in a Western culture. And of course, it has an element of reparative justice to it, because many of these indigenous human remains are only in museum collections as a result of colonial violence, of settler violence, of genocide against indigenous populations. And so this also feeds into the rationale where there are these specific rules for the repatriation of indigenous human remains. And then the tricky question becomes whether such an ancestral framing can be extended to hominin fossils, and how far back the ancestral framing can actually reach.
Yeah, because I would think far enough back, technically, everyone could claim to be an ancestor of some hominin fossils, at least.
Yeah, and I mean it really, and again the problem becomes where you draw the line. One very famous repatriation case for human remains from the United States is the case of Kennewick Man. Now, Kennewick Man was found in the late 90s in the state of Washington, and it's an almost complete skeleton of a man who died some 8,400 years ago. So really quite a while back. And there was initially some uncertainty as to the ethnic affiliation of Kennewick Man, and a court case that went up to the Court of Appeals in 2004 rejected a repatriation claim from the indigenous tribe, or from the Native American tribes in the area, because the court found that they had no cultural affiliation with Kennewick Man, or they couldn't demonstrate such an affiliation. However, 10 years later, a DNA study from Danish researchers, or DNA study that was conducted in Denmark, showed that actually Kennewick Man was more closely affiliated to these Native American tribes than to any other population that currently exists. And this then was enough to demonstrate the cultural affiliation that the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act requires. And the remains of Kennewick Man were removed from the museum collection and buried in an undisclosed location. And we have other cases from settler colonies, so from the US, from Australia, these countries, where prehistoric human remains have been returned to the First Nations of these countries as their ancestors. So this would indicate some support of the idea that you can really have a very, very, very distant ancestor, and that this counts as ancestral repatriation. However, these are also places where no other hominins than Homo sapiens have ever existed. And these are among the last places that have been populated by humans, historically speaking. And so there is really, there's none of the confusion of asking yourself whether a Homo erectus found in Australia would also be considered an ancestor within the context of the respective indigenous repatriation laws, the same way that a Homo sapiens would. And so the same logic is difficult to translate to the case of Zambia, for instance, where there's a long history of hominin presence that goes back 500,000 years, where multiple population groups have migrated into the territory and out of it. There, it's a lot less easy to say. Also, the concept of indigeneity is one that is received very differently in the African continent than it is in the context of the Western settler colonies. So this is, I think, is the trickiest part in the debate around the repatriation of hominin fossils.
Is there, this is probably a cruel question, is there a way, is there a way that you could come up with laws that work for hominin fossils or for natural history objects in general that would sort of help fix the problems? Like, is there a blanket solution, or is it up to every single individual country to have, their own laws, and then to hope that other countries are going to, reciprocate or abide by them, or be willing to negotiate on situations?
Yeah. So I don't necessarily enjoy the idea of putting myself in the shoes of a world legislator, and I would like to question whether law is actually the solution here. Because I think there's often a bit of an overconfidence what the law can achieve reasonably, and to me, it's more often a last resort than the magical solution to anything. Because in the end, resorting to the law and potential judicial enforcement, all these things are or can easily be perceived as hostile acts, and can be perceived as highly confrontational in nature, because it really involves an appeal to a higher authority, namely the law or the relevant enforcement institution, to tell someone else that you want what they have, essentially. And I think there's a common misconception of restitution, repatriation discourses, and disputes as being zero sum, and I don't believe they are. I don't believe in the narrative that it's two institutions or two entities fighting about one artifact, one object, and either one gets it or the other. Because I think there is a lot of space for collaborative solutions. And it's really not just the control of the artifact in itself, but there's a lot that surrounds it. There is a whole echo, if you will, that the artifact leaves in the collection of an institution, that goes to the data that is being produced, to the documentation, to the history of the artifact in that collection. Also the intellectual property. I mean, many museums sell merch with the specimens and the objects that they have in their collections. This plays into it. And at the same time, just because the object physically is in one institution doesn't mean it has to be there 100% of the time. And it also doesn't mean that this institution can't put aside a bit of money to fund research stays or fellowships for researchers from the country of origin of that artifact, so that they can come and study it without the cost being on them, or vice versa. And I think there's so much space for creative, collaborative solutions, that we don't always have to go the confrontational route. Why I also don't think that creating new laws to address all of this is really the way to go. I think the way to go is really to accept that this is a major challenge, not only for cultural museums, but also for natural history museums. And this is a major challenge that is not being resolved, or not going to be resolved, by shutting down, or by playing dumb, or by denying that all of this, that natural history museums are political and socially relevant. This is not the way to go. To my mind, the way to go is to be open to reasonable dialogue, taking the other side seriously, and making a genuine effort to find collaborative solutions and to build a relationship of trust. Because, of course, in the end, I mean, you have no real reason to trust each other, and suing each other won't help with that. It really won't. But really trying to make little steps in getting to know each other and understanding each other's perspective, and then gradually moving towards maybe first a loan and then a full repatriation, and then an initial relationship of trust, expanding, spilling over into other areas. Because in the end, then there's also no need. So then repatriation is also not necessarily a loss for the institution that gives up the object. It's just it introduces a different stage in the relationship of the institution with the object, and this stage is then featured by this institution not being the exclusive guardian over it anymore. But again, this is not a loss. I think there's a lot to gain from a collaborative, open-minded approach to it. And so I think one size fits all legislation or anything is not really is neither feasible nor desirable. I think it's really time for the mindset of the higher ups in the world of natural history, to acknowledge all of this and to sincerely and collaboratively and openly engage with these issues.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot more sense because at the moment it does sort of seem like a win-lose sort of case. Like someone gets something at the end of it and the other side gets nothing. And obviously that's why, certain groups are then wanting to return things because they're like, well, we get nothing out of this. You get your artifacts back. We end up with an empty museum display and less tourists because that's what the people were here for. But it does make sense that if we try and see things more in a collaborative way and have discussions surrounding things, that maybe you can do slow transitions of objects, or like you said, have researchers even like at a baseline. I feel like provide funding for researchers from the home country to come over and study their own objects, and that would at least be a good first step, I would think, to relationships between different institutions or countries.
Yeah, and I think this relational aspect is really crucial. And there, it's going to be the negotiation and the engagement, the dialogue that builds these bridges where law would be prone to burning them. I think.
Hmm. Yeah, it
Just
does.
to be or just to be clear, I'm also this sound like I don't have any trust in the law whatsoever. This is also not the case. And I believe this is the first thing I said, that the law to me is more the last resort than the magical solution. And I do think that there should be a legal pathway to get these things back if the negotiation route fails. The reality is just that due to the issue of non-retroactivity, it will often be very difficult to use legal means for at least hominin fossils or human remains more generally that have been removed such a long time ago. But I think this the flaws that the law has in addressing the wrongs of the past make it all the more necessary to engage with the ethical dilemmas, tackle them head on, and in a collaborative fashion.
I don't envy you doing this research because it seems like a lot. Like there's a lot that goes into it. Is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you feel like people should know?
I mean, there's always more, but I think this is I think it's a nice and round overview of the of the restitution problematique and of the role that law can play or not in the restitution of hominin fossils, and how much of an issue it is in the first place.
Okay. Well, it's been a very
Actually,
interesting.
can I give
Yeah.
that answer again? I think
Hmm.
that wasn't as concise as I would have liked it to be. No, I mean, there's always more to say about these topics, but in the end, I think this is a relatively dense first impression of well, the question of hominin fossils, the extent to which they can be considered human remains for the different purposes, what the law can do in this context, what it struggles with, what it can't do, and what we should be doing instead.
Yes, it is. It is a very big topic. So I do feel like this is a good overview. I am more educated than I was when I started. So if anyone wants to learn more about this topic or your research, are there any maybe resources you could recommend? I will have them linked below. But if anyone wants to search anything up, where would you maybe recommend looking first?
Yeah. I mean, I try to keep my website always up to date with everything I do. So you can find me at paul-stewens with a w.com. And I also have two papers on human remains that I will be submitting to peer review shortly. So if everything goes well, those will be up and open to the public sometime soon. So watch the space for the papers to come out eventually. And yeah, other than that, we're going to try and put the few things that I've been mentioning along the way in the description, so you can read up on a few of the points that I've been raising.
Mhm. Wonderful. Well, make sure everybody to check the description to follow up on more if you're interested. Thank you, Paul, so much for coming on. This has been a very interesting topic in a field that I have zero expertise in. So thank you for coming on and for sharing that with us.
Pleasure was all mine. I'd come back anytime.
Wonderful. And thank you to the listeners for tuning in. I will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, guys.